You're listening to Politics Unspun with me, Jack McCluskey.
And me, Charlie Carter.
We're two economists discussing the hottest political debates.
Like, do tax cuts really boost economic growth?
How high should the minimum wage be?
Is Scotland ready for independence?
Should post-work pints be free?
Yes. And because there's nothing we love more than the sound of our own voices, we're putting our future career prospects on the line to share our thoughts on each one of these deliciously controversial topics.
We hope you enjoy. Hello and welcome to Politics Unspun. This episode we're discussing pensions, but before we get to that, Charlie has been in Norway.
I have. I'm sort of a little bit upset to get back to the UK because Norway is the perfect country, so I've loved it. But I was out there for an economics conference. It was essentially just a labour economics conference, so bringing 500, 600 of the best labour economists in Europe together. I was very lucky to present my work there, and it was absolutely fascinating. We're going to have a lot to talk about over the next few weeks, Jack, trying to consolidate some of that information and think on what some of the best labour economists in the continent think that we should be doing politically.
Yeah, I'm going to be using you as a font of knowledge on some key topics, Charlie. And I'm also very jealous that you have been mingling with these rock stars of economics.
I have, yeah, not real rock stars, but not real rock stars, but economic rock stars, you know.
Yes, but getting back to the issue at hand, so pensions, it's safe to say it's a topic that surprised both of us.
It's been absolutely fascinating, Jack. I mean, originally when we were thinking about doing this podcast, I thought the pensions was one we're going to just get out the way, forget about it, move on, because I didn't think there was much. I thought it was a very political issue and not necessarily very economic, but boy, have I been proven wrong. I mean, pensions are one of the most distorted markets in the economy. It's one of the most difficult things to get right. There's a lot of different factors you've got to consider. And obviously it's a market of such incomplete information that the free market just doesn't do a very good job of making it very efficient. So it's a great market to think about, and how can economists actually get right.
Yes, and we're basing a lot of our research was from a report, I believe. You've got it in front of you.
So I've got it in front of me. This was a report done by Peter Diamond, who is, given that we're talking about rock stars, the rock star of pension reform. And he wrote a paper alongside Nicholas Barr talking about the ins and outs of pensions from a very non-theoretical perspective. But he was talking about what we need to do with pension reform, basically. And I just thought I'd read you this end quote, this conclusion. If nothing else, we probably succeeded in convincing the reader that the analysis of pension reform proposals is complex and that overly simple, incomplete comparisons are not a sound way to proceed. And Charlie and Jack should get their grubbly little mitts off it before they ruin it for the UK and the rest of the world. So yeah, that's exactly how it's written, word for word. And I think that just sums up why it's so interesting, right? That it's so complex, so intricate. How do we get this right?
You're so right. And it's a perfect topic for our podcast, really, for that reason. Pensions are highly political. If we talk about them in the public space, people get very uneasy. But there's a huge amount of economics that you've got to wade through before you can start getting to the subjective elements that really should be political. So I really don't understand why people would ever try and reform it without listening to us first.
Yeah, no, I mean, I don't know why they've been trying for the last century. It's ridiculous. They should have been waiting for this podcast.
Exactly. Now, we can't cover everything, unfortunately, so we won't be focusing just on UK pension systems and the details of that. We're going to be looking at a more broad idea of what pensions are and what the problems are. So, starting in that vein, Charlie, why do we need pensions?
Yeah, so essentially we need pensions because we can't leave it to the free market, right? Obviously, it's very intuitive that because people can't work when they're older, they need some form of income. They need to be able to consume goods and services. So how do we facilitate that? And you obviously can't allow people to just sort of guess how long they're going to live, guess the amount of savings they need, because obviously, you know, when we die is uncertain. So you don't want to save until you're expecting to live to 100, but then you die at 60, and vice versa. You don't want to save to live till you're 60, but then, you know, live till you're 100. So there's a lot of uncertainty here. So pensions are essentially a political policy way of exploiting the fact that we don't know when one person is going to die. But because of this mathematical theorem called the law of large numbers, we know when the average person is going to die. And that's really important because it allows us to build a much more effective, efficient policy than people just individually saving for themselves when there is so much uncertainty.
Very well put, Charlie. And there are two main funding schemes. So you've got the pay-as-you-go scheme, basically what states and governments use normally. And that works like an intergenerational transfer. And that's a very complex way of saying that the productive youth pay taxes, which then
do we fall into the category of productive youth? Just on a little side
well, we're
note?
youth. I don't know about the productive. But the idea is that people not like us, but productive individuals pay taxes that are paying for pensioners in the current time period. Whereas that's different to the fully funded system, which is more often seen in private pensions, which is where all those savings go into a pot and those accumulate interest, and then that's paid out to those same individuals in the future. And that has different ramifications for the amount of saving and other things, but we're going to get into that. I don't want to get ahead of myself. So we're going to start off, given that we've got our resident labour market economist in the room, let's talk about labour market distortions.
Is that me, or do we have a special guest?
No, we're going to bring him on.
Oh, yeah, okay, good, yeah. Yeah, well, I think just a way of motivating this sort of the interest in pensions is just to look at the effects it has on the labour market. You know, obviously, when you have a system whereby someone is paid an income after they retire, there is going to be natural implications on how much they want to work prior to their retirement. And I think a really good way of showing this is in the case of Boston, whereby they had a pension system where your pension only depended on your end of career earnings, and it didn't depend on your mid-career earnings. So what would happen is people would have very little incentive to work much, much harder in their early career. And then when it came to the end of their career, these people who are a little bit more elderly would overexert themselves, overwork in an effort to try get pay rises so they can get this higher pension. And this would often lead to the case where elderly train drivers would fall asleep on their job, which is a little bit of a problem. You would have people where, people would have unfortunate incidents and falls. And it just goes to show how much pensions can influence working behavior prior to the lifetime. And that's why a lot of economists say that pensions are so important, because we don't want to distort labor market behavior beforehand.
I think that's a really interesting point, and not something I'd really thought about when we first picked the topic.
No,
of pensions.
absolutely. No, not at all.
No, what we normally think about, that's the first thing, between those pay-as-you-go and fully funded system, is about savings.
Savings and growth, right? Yeah, I mean, that's so political at the moment, isn't it? Just how do we grow the economy? And, I never really thought the pensions could relate to economic growth, but here we are.
Exactly. So we would assume, right, that fully funded system would lead to more savings.
Yeah, essentially just because, if we're essentially mandating saving, if the government is mandating saving, that people have to save to pay for their own pensions when they're older, then you naturally have a system whereby individuals are saving more and leading to a higher national savings. And for the viewers who aren't economists, national savings are the pool from which investment is generated. So the idea is that if we can increase savings, we can increase the level of economic growth, or at least the economic output.
Absolutely. And we can split that into two parts, because savings are used for two different reasons, really. You could break it down to capital accumulation, which is very important, but also it goes into things like research and development, which is, we believe at least, the key link between savings and growth, because it leads to productivity growth, which is essential.
Yeah, so obviously funding is basically the ideal way of trying to increase savings. But I think I would sort of push back against some of this in some context, saying that just because you're having higher levels of savings or higher funding system doesn't necessarily mean that you're moving towards a higher economic output. And one of the reasons this might happen is just because you're having higher levels of savings doesn't necessarily mean that you're investing into higher productive capital. One of the examples of this is in the 1970s, British trade unions actually invested a lot of their money into paintings, which isn't particularly productive, so it doesn't necessarily lead to economic growth. And you also have a situation, especially in developing countries, that if financial markets or capital markets aren't very developed, then you can actually have a situation where higher savings doesn't really lead to production of higher levels of productive capital. And that's a real issue when you're thinking about the funding system. You also have this problem whereby if the government is using the money it's saving from not paying as a pay-as-you-go system and it's just investing it into other things, then national savings doesn't really increase because the government has just used it as an excuse to spend it on other stuff. So there are some problems with the funding system, and it depends. I think Peter Diamond sort of says the relationship between savings and economic growth and funding and the pay-as-you-go system is really complex, and it can't be boiled down to just really simplistic arguments just around saving. But yeah, that's a really interesting point as well.
And I believe I've heard that people might even reduce their voluntary savings if you increase mandatory savings. So it's
a complex relation. I think, though, if those assumptions don't hold, then you obviously have quite a good justification for moving to a funded-based system, whereby people save and then use their savings and their rate of return on that, pay for their own pension. But obviously you've got to consider all these other things which come up in different parts of the world.
Yeah, absolutely. I think so. Now, there is an argument, though, Charlie, that I've heard
Because I was shouting it at you, probably.
that you might might save too much.
Well, yeah, no. So there's this argument in economic theory called dynamic inefficiency. And this exists in what's called overlapping generation models, which are very mathematical and very technical, but it's an interesting way of motivating pensions. And basically, it's an idea if you have a world where people are obviously, there's lots of different generations and people don't work when they're old, then it can be the case under some technical assumptions that young people who are productive oversave in anticipation of their retirement, because they have to save to be able to pay for their retirement in the absence of pensions. And this essentially leads to an overaccumulation of savings, which can actually lead to an overall negative effect on the economy. And you can actually improve the efficiency of the economy by reducing the amount young people save and giving it to old people. And this can essentially lead to higher consumption, high happiness, higher welfare, all that sort of stuff. And that's essentially the main theoretical motivation for pay-as-you-go, right, Jack?
Emphasis on theoretical there, Charlie. we devoted plenty of our time at undergraduate learning this neat theoretical model and then finding out that
it's bullshit, isn't it? I mean,
just-
it's not real. No, it's ridiculous. You know, it's a nice theoretical justification, but it doesn't happen all the time. Some very strict theoretical assumptions have to be met for this to be the case. Some criteria have to be met, and what we'd see empirically is that this criteria just isn't met in the real world. Which is
no, I mean,
hilarious.
the clear, obvious indicator is that it relies on there being too much saving, leading to too much capital accumulation, and empirical data suggests we actually save too little rather than too much. So that's out
especially
of
in
the water
UK.
already.
Yeah.
But the second part is that those assumptions you talk about, Charlie, one of them is that you need to have quite high population growth. And we're in the opposite scenario, which is actually a perfect segue into the next part of this discussion, which is demographics. So one of the arguments against the pay-as-you-go system, or actually why pensions have sort of become a political topic recently, is because we're aware that the portion of our government expenditure going towards pensions is rising because of two things. One, that our fertility rates are going down, that population growth is slowing, but also that people are living longer. And that means that our capability for the young to pay for the old is decreasing over time. And that means the portion of our government expenditure going towards pensions is rising, and some would say unsustainably. What's the argument for switching to a fully funded system in this case?
Well, moving to a fully funded system basically means that we're not relying on the dependency ratio as much because people are paying for their own pension. So the generation that is getting the pension is being funded by that same generation. And the argument essentially goes that as you move to a fully funded system, these demographic issues aren't a problem. But that's not necessarily the case, is it, Jack?
No. So the thing is that the pay-as-you-go system, it's very clear what's happening. You can see that the dependency ratio is increasing, and of course that means that the expenditures are rising, and it's very visible. The thing is that actually there's an argument that the fully funded system faces exactly the same problems, they're just more hidden, which is why this is an interesting topic, Charlie, because the easy side of it is the living longer part. Well, obviously, you need to save more when you're young if you're going to live longer. So the fully funded system would still face that problem. The more hidden aspect is that lower population growth. Now, that is linked to lower output, but also a higher capital intensity. And I don't want to get into the technicalities of that, but what it means is that when people reach their old age, prices will be higher because there's less output being shared around, and the interest rate would have been lower because of that higher capital intensity. And the important thing there is that they would have been able to accumulate less wealth for their pensions, and that also that won't go as far because the prices will be higher. So actually, the fully funded system faces the same problem, just it's less visible. And that's so interesting.
But yeah. I mean, that obviously relies on a few different assumptions. And I think I'm actually going to push back on that argument a little bit, because that relies fundamentally on labour and capital being what we call complements, i.e. they work together to produce output. And essentially that argument goes, if they're complements, then you have fewer people, there's less growth, that leads to lower rate of return, and that essentially leads to the same effect on consumption outcomes as the pay-as-you-go system. But if you were to assume that as AI develops and as capital becomes more and more advanced, there is an argument, especially in some of the inequality literature, that capital and labour are going to become actually substitutes, i.e. they're competing against each other for the production of output. And if that was the case, then that line of argument actually reverses. And you actually have less people, more growth, higher rates of return, and that has actually a positive effect. So it sort of depends on the extent to which you think that capital and labor are complements, they work together, or they actually are competitive against each other. And that's a really interesting point.
Oh, I think that's exceptional bit of analysis from you, Charlie. I would never have thought of questioning
my greatness.
Yeah, because we always learn in pretty much every model you see or have seen, it's always been the idea that capital and labour are complements. It's this classic Cobb-Douglas function that we learn in economics. But I think I have seen some places that people are suggesting that with AI, that it is becoming more like substitute. So that's a really interesting point you brought up there, Charlie, I think.
Thank you very much.
And something that I don't think... Is he Peter Diamond? I can't remember. Mr. Diamond or Professor
Diamond. That nerd didn't say anything about that. No.
He didn't even think of it, Charlie. Exactly. So hats off to you. That's our piece of originality for the
pension reform
episode. Now, at this point, I think it's best to ask, which do you think is better, Charlie?
Well, I think fundamentally I prefer a funded system for developing countries. I think having a funding system can improve savings. If you have a developed financial sector, that naturally translates into economic growth. And because the dynamic efficiency argument doesn't really hold any water in developed countries, I think the funded system is a good way to go for developed countries. But I think it changes when you move into a developing country context. I think because financial sectors aren't particularly developed in developing countries, you have a real problem that these high levels of savings aren't converted into high levels of capital. And I think this is only compounded by issues surrounding corruption and other institutional failures. So I think it really depends on whether you're a developing or developed country, if I'm honest.
That's interesting. So you're saying fully funded for a developed country and a pay-as-you-go system for a developing country?
Yeah, obviously depending on the exact specificities of each country we're talking about. But yes, broadly I'd say that's the case.
That's interesting. I think an argument against that would be that it's actually the developing countries that benefit most from capital accumulation. In the developed world, the idea is that we've sort of reached our steady state. Now, that's another technical term for you listeners. But the idea is that a lot of our growth actually comes from productivity growth and long-run growth rather than just capital accumulation, whereas developing countries might benefit more from these savings. But I completely understand your argument, Charlie, that there is corruption. There's also just a mismatch between savings actually reaching investment.
Yeah, I mean, I would sort of push back against that again, because I think in sort of more what we call endogenous growth frameworks, you have a situation where higher investment can be channeled into research and development. So I think it's slightly more complex. I think you can channel it into different means. It doesn't just add to the capital stock, but yeah, I think that would be my position. I think the main problem we have with it is that I wouldn't necessarily suggest that if a developed country is operating a pay-as-you-go system, transitioning to a fully funded system is a very good idea, because I think that transition is going to be so painful that it sort of negates any of the benefits that you would have seen from a fully funded system. The transition is so painful that you don't actually get any welfare benefit.
We definitely agree on that. Whilst if you were first designing the system, you probably would, in my opinion, go for a fully funded system. There is, once you're in the system that you're in with the pay-as-you-go system, to transition would be so costly, because you can imagine that at least one generation is going to be both paying for their pension and paying for someone else's.
Yeah, exactly. You'd have a generation whereby, let's say, we were the unlucky generation, which is somewhat foreseeable, that has to pay for the older generation, what a world that would be, and we'd have to transition to a fully funded system, then we would essentially be paying for two pension systems. We'd be paying for the older generation and our own pension. So it would really hit hard the welfare of one particular generation. And they are currently doing this in Chile with complete disregard for this fact. And I think the political issues are just so difficult to manage, right?
Yes, politically, it spans so many different governments, and sometimes we worry about one singular government being able to commit to one plan for the full 4 years. This is something that would cover, how long do we say? Something like 45 years, right?
It's going to be 45 years. Yeah, 45 years. Yeah.
Decades, and it would span that many governments, and you'd need all of them to agree, and all agree to a very gradual transition. And I can foresee that the only way of really making it working is that you have the people who are born being mostly in the fully funded system, and then the people who are about to retire being mostly in the pay-as-you-go system. And to get the granularity of each year sort of gradually transitioning between the two is, I mean, the administrative cost alone, I'm not sure that our politicians are capable of doing this.
No, and obviously there's such a difference in opinion on pensions reform. I don't foresee a situation where you'd be able to have 45 years of consecutive governments agreeing on the exact granularity of the detail. Because also it's going to change as the years go on, right? You're going to be hit with different shocks, economic shocks, and you're going to have to change the the pension system to accommodate that. And I don't know if you could have a 45 years of uninterrupted policy. I just think that would be
Absolutely. And like I said at the beginning, pensions are something that you don't want to change too much because it makes people feel so uneasy that you are tampering with what's meant as effectively social security, right?
We're recording this at the time of the cut of the winter fuel allowance, and I've just recently read on the Financial Times about how there's already pressure for a U-turn, even after a very simple change like winter fuel allowance. There's so much political pressure to keep pensioners in a very high standard of living that it's difficult to change.
Yes, absolutely. Now, moving on to an argument that sounds like it's exactly the same one we've just had, but it is slightly different. And this is the difference between state and private pensions. So obviously, state pensions are normally pay-as-you-go systems, and private systems are normally fully funded systems. But you can imagine a system where you could have a fully funded state system or a pay-as-you-go sort of private system. So when we start getting into that, we start first thinking about the distributional aspects of having a state versus private. And one of the things that comes up is the triple lock.
I hate the triple lock, Jack. I think it was created by Satan himself. I despise it. I despise it with all of my soul. It's the antithesis of what we don't like on this podcast, which is overly politicized policy decisions that have no real basis in reality. Does that set this up well enough? Did I make my point clear?
I think we know how you feel. Would you like to calm down and then maybe define what the triple lock is and then why you should be slating it?
Well, so the triple lock is essentially defined to pay state pensions, and essentially it just means that state pensions have to increase in the UK by the highest of the following things, and that is wage growth, the CPI index, so inflation, or 2.5%. And essentially what this means is that pensioners are kept in a very high standard of living, and it costs the government an absolute fortune to maintain this. The IFS, the Institute for Fiscal Studies, estimated it's going to cost about 24 billion extra in 3 decades in today's value. And on that basis, it assumes that the triple lock should be scrapped. And I think a lot of economic pundits do believe in the scrapping of the triple lock because it is fundamentally financially unviable and unsustainable. It costs the UK government an absolute fortune, and it makes no sense even as a policy. Even in the case whereby prices don't increase and the wages don't increase, then you still have this 2.5% increase for pensioners, which naturally comes out of the pockets of productive working people who are currently massively struggling. And that's in the case where there's no increase in inflation or wage growth. And also, I mean, even there's a nice bit of theory that suggests that even pension indexing itself increases welfare, even without any real increase in income. So I don't understand this whole 2.5%, and I don't really understand the wage growth element either.
Yes, because you can see why the CPI part's in there. It's to stop them falling into absolute poverty. Then you can sort of get the wage growth, although we've got problems with it, that it deals with the relative poverty argument.
Yeah, well, the wage growth there is essentially just a statistical manipulation, isn't it, to a degree? It's a way of politicians to manipulate the fact that people won't fall into relative poverty, which is different to absolute poverty, but it's essentially a way of keeping newspapers off their backs, isn't it?
But we've got a problem with it that it's wage growth rather than just GDP growth. So it doesn't incorporate any of the demographic change, which makes it, well, is inherently why it makes it unaffordable.
I mean, I assume the UK's government's justification for it is by saying, oh, well, if outside wages are increasing, then essentially we have the ability to pay for it. So it doesn't really matter if it's increasing by wage growth, which is completely wrong, because you have a situation whereby it's not just wage growth that is defining how affordable this policy is. You have to consider the aggregate amount of income, and that depends on population growth as well. And we're seeing a falling population. So it makes much more sense to fund it on a GDP basis rather than just the wage growth, which is also much more affordable for the UK. And that money could be siphoned into making the UK more productive, improving health outcomes, improving educational standards, improving our infrastructure, which has much more benefits for economic growth than essentially these welfare transfer payments that aren't productive.
Because that's what they are, aren't they? It's nothing to do with productivity. This is why we've put it in the distributional section. It's a distribution between generations, and it is beyond me why it should be the youth distributing welfare to the elderly who have benefited from a housing bubble or housing crisis, where they were buying assets very cheap and now they're worth a lot of money.
I mean, it's a situation like if you're discounting a dynamic efficiency argument, which we obviously have, then it makes no sense for this current generation to be paying for the older generation in the way it's currently doing it. Because it's a generation, let's be honest, that has benefited massively from housing price increases. And this is a generation our generation is currently, and the generation above us is currently massively struggling with housing costs, cost of living, as well as crumbling services. I mean, absolutely abysmal. I was on the trains recently, and it's absolutely astonishing how bad they are, especially when you compare it to other Northern European countries. It's unbelievable. And it's a situation where we're paying for pensioners in excess of what the country earns. And I think it's ridiculous, just for political benefit.
Yeah. So it seems a little bit odd. So now moving...
Also just another thing. Why would we, if we're going to triple lock pensions, it makes much more sense to triple lock the public sector pay. I know it's a lot more expensive, but there's also massive competition benefits. It means that the public sector doesn't lag the private sector in terms of the ability of its ability to attract talent, skilled human capital. It also means that people are going to be much more productive, much more effective, and you have a public sector that works much more beneficial, much better, which can only be positive for future generations. So we're sort of stuck with this stagnant technocratic policy that doesn't really work.
Moving on to we'll just briefly touch on it, the other side, the distributional argument for state versus private pension is the distribution within generations as well. So it does, where our system is a flat sort of pension, where it's not based on your income, higher earning individuals don't receive a higher state pension. That is a within generation distribution from the richest to the poorest. And I think that side we're agreeing with, right?
Yes, I think so. I'm not as passionate about this side because I'm still debating it, if I'm completely honest. But a lot of the economic theory, as economic theory tends to suggest, is that if you intervene in a market through means testing or redistribution in any way that affects labour supply or saving, then you can actually get efficiency losses. So there's a paper that was written in 2012 which essentially argued that if you asset means test, if you have a situation where poorer pensioners are paid more than higher pensioners, then you essentially distort the savings behaviour and labour supply decisions of people before they retire, and that can essentially lead to efficiency losses. And that is a point that we need to consider and we can't just discount because it is quite interesting. But I would push back on that a little bit because just from a intuitive perspective, as some work done by Peter Diamond says, you can't have a modern economy without some level of labour market or savings market distortions. You have to consider equality and fairness when you're doing this. And also, I would argue that the model that I just mentioned doesn't incorporate things like the opportunity cost of spending on education or infrastructure or other things that generate productivity increases. So I think if they were to include a more sophisticated model, incorporate other things, that the savings benefits you generate from asset means testing could filter back into efficiency in other ways. But obviously that's open to interpretation. That's what you sort of think as well, right? Or
no, that's a nice level of analysis. I think that you do have to. It's a constant battle in economics, is the difference between equity and efficiency, right? That it seems like any time, it's not always true. There are times when it's not true, but there are cases where any time that you try and improve equity, that you do end up affecting efficiency. I think if we were like a purely, because in the UK we're a mix of state and privatised pensions. If we were a purely state system, obviously it makes sense that people who earned more in their lifetime were more productive, they also receive a higher pension. It should maybe taper off slightly in a way that links a little bit to the income brackets and income tax rates. But you get the idea that there is a benefit to within generation distribution from rich to poor.
Absolutely. And it's just something else you've got to consider. It's something I haven't given enough thought as it deserves. And it's something I probably don't have that strong an opinion on yet, but it's something I need to think about more.
Yeah.
Definitely.
We don't have to have opinions on everything. We can just sort of push out some ideas and opinions and see what sticks, right? But
Absolutely.
moving on to another reason that you might choose a state over a private system, and this is that it's to protect people from themselves a little bit. So this is the fact that quite frequently there are irrationally low savings. This, I believe I've seen statistics saying that this is potentially more of a problem for the poorer parts of our society, which is especially concerning from a social security standpoint. You can envision a world where the poorest in our society don't save at all enough for their pension, and they end up elderly pensioners on the streets, and you don't want to see that in our society, do you? And then you've also got this problem with lack of financial knowledge, and that is especially important. If we leave it purely to a private system and people are willing to risk all their pension on things like Bitcoin, which are highly volatile assets that maybe they don't quite understand properly, then you can envision a world where, again, you've got pensioners with no money because they made the wrong choice.
Yeah, exactly. This is such a complex market, and I think having a system where you're relying purely on private pensions just invites the possibility that people don't know what they're doing, invest into the wrong pension funds, are manipulated by people who are trying to essentially scam them, and you get a situation where you get older and you don't have any money to rely on, or much less than you thought you would. And because the financial market is so volatile, I don't think it's a system you can you can't completely privatize the pension system. I do fundamentally believe that, because there's so much misinformation and disinformation and imperfect information that people who aren't complete experts, which is 99% of the population, can't make very good informed decisions on this. And that's why you do need a state system that is, if you were to do fully funded, I do think you need a state system whereby you have technical expertise and it's all essentially pulled into a very diversified, well-run fund.
Yeah. I think the point is that we ask people to specialise in certain things, and I don't think we can expect every citizen in our society to know how the financial system works, what bonds are, what equity is. But the argument against this is that it does inhibit freedom, and that's both of saving size. Some people might want to save less for their retirement. They might care more about the short term than the long term, and that is part of their welfare function. But also the freedom to pick your investments. If it is a state-run, fully funded system, I guess the concern is that you're not picking your investments, and that does affect or manipulate or distorts the capital markets.
This is the sort of an American Republican argument that, anything we do inhibits their freedom. But I couldn't give much weight to that argument. You can't have freedom over things that you don't fully understand.
Yeah, but the point still stands that people care a lot about their freedom, so that is something people would think about. The next point is about, it sort of links to what we just said about the stock market, really. It's this risk sharing part. So the first part is what you talked about before, Charlie, sort of the pooling, what we would call idiosyncratic risk, which is basically individual risk. When you spread it over a wider population, it's less of a problem. And because the state system is non-actuarial, we're not using data from people to work out how long they're expected to live. It means that you sort of share risk without any knowledge of what state each person's in, which is nice. We might want that. But also, it's a social safety net for the stock market. So this is, again, between generation distributions, where we're thinking that some generations might have lost out from a stock market crash or something. And we might want the other generations who haven't faced that problem to sort of bail out the ones that were affected by something like the 2008 crash. No points on that. We're happy with that.
I really don't care about the state versus private section.
That's fair enough. Well, I'll quickly wrap up with the last point, which is the one that Paul Krugman, in his book Arguing with Zombies being these ideas that won't die even against all this empirical evidence, and these ideas that continue to eat people's brains, is actually the first one that he writes in his book about, is that the state system is better than a private system like what we've got in the UK, whereas in America they're still actually on a state system, which is quite interesting given how they're normally all about freedom. But the main point he makes is that the state system has significantly lower administrative fees, and that might only be like sort of 1% per year, but because of how compound interest works, that could lead to something like a 20% reduction in your final pot that you have to live on. So that's one major argument he makes for the state system. So I think I've heard one argument, I believe this was from you, Charlie, that maybe the reason they've got lower administrative fees is just tied in with the fact that state systems are normally a pay-as-you-go system. I think probably true, actually. But there are other savings that are made, especially to do with what I talked about, the actuarial side of private pensions, which requires a lot of data and monitoring, and that causes administrative fees as well. But I'm not sure of what percentage it would be between the pay-as-you-go system side and the fact that it's non-actuarial. But the point still stands. Anyway,
Yeah,
I think
absolutely.
we've managed to cover a very difficult and complex topic. Hopefully within 30 minutes. That would be ideal, wouldn't it?
Well, we'll see. Depends how the editing goes, I guess.
Yeah. Well, we will see you next time, hopefully for another one as interesting as we found this topic.
Toodaloo.